Not everybody. All right, welcome everybody. God bless you. Happy and joyous feast. It's a not feasting feast. It's a strict fast feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross, but it is a perfect holiday for us to begin our visitation once again of this fine book, The Religion of the Apostles by Father Stephen DeYoung. We're picking up where we left off at the end of May, I guess, or maybe June even. And we're going to be starting chapter 7, which is on atonement for the whole world. So it's an appropriate topic for an appropriate day. If you haven't been able to get the book or you haven't read the book, that's okay. You don't need to for the source of this point of this class. Highly recommend it, though. If you haven't seen or heard the other classes previously, you don't have to do that either, actually, because kind of from here on out, it kind of takes a slightly different kind of course. And whereas before a lot of the stuff was building on top of itself, the next part maybe doesn't need as much of that backstory. However, if you'd like to find out about that, of course, you can go visit our YouTube channel and watch all of our videos on discovering the religion of the apostles. And there is a video that is a summary of chapters 1 through 6 and a summary of all the classes beforehand, which was something like 15 or 16 classes, I think. So we're going to take our sweet time with this. I'm in no rush to get through the rest of the book, so I'm hoping to take my time falling into every rabbit hole I possibly can find along the way, because this has been a really just a self-indulgence overall for me, but I think you're enjoying it as well. So let's pull up our happy video and see if we can get this started. Ta-da. Yes. There we go. All right, once again, here's what's left of the book. It doesn't seem like a lot, 3 chapters, but there's actually a lot of material in those 3 chapters, and there's a lot to kind of unpack as we go. So my hope is that this will take us through the rest of 2022 and possibly into January of 2023, but hopefully we'll get most of it finished off by the end of this year. Just the Atonement chapter itself, as we look, has a pretty rich outline. We're not even going to get into the bullet points of the chapter. We're just doing the introduction to the chapter today because we're kind of working our way back into things. So topics in this chapter include these: wrath of God, propitiation and expiation, handwriting of our sins, the tree of the cross, not only for our sins, but for the whole world. Okay. So as we go, you might get tickled with, oh, what about this? Or I want to ask about that. And there may be a number of times where I will say, we'll get to that later in this chapter, because there's a lot to cover and it does tie into a whole bunch of stuff. But for the most part, I just wanted to start tonight with a basic overview of what in the world is atonement, besides a really sad movie with, who's in that movie? Keira Knightley? Somebody like that? I don't know. My kids know it. The word itself is an interesting word because it's a word that was made up to explain a word in the Bible that really had no kind of English equivalent. And so John Wycliffe is accredited with giving the first use of it as at-one-ment, from which it was later kind of condensed into atonement. So that was in Middle English as he was translating the Latin in the 14th century. And of course, for John, as you can see here, suffered the burning of his books and kind of became a proto-martyr, if you will, for the Reformation, because nobody liked what he was doing in the Latin West. They wanted to keep the control there, I guess. We would have liked it. We would have enjoyed that. By the 16th century, this term atonement, though, was in common use, and you will see it all over the place in Bible translations. And what's funny is it's just kind of become assumed as the word, even though there's no explanation. This word means this. Well, what does that mean? Word mean? Well, it means that word. So there's no real one-to-one equivalency of it. So you will see lots of different terms used for atonement in place of atonement, in place of the Hebrew or the Greek in some cases for those words. You will see it translated as reconciliation, purgation, purification, forgiveness, absolution. I've seen, so it's all over the place in terms of what it might be, and it's kind of like a family of values, right? It's they're not all so different from each other, but there's nuances across the whole spectrum of them. The Greek word that's used in place of the Hebrew is elasmos, and from elasmos comes then the Latin. Don't ask me to pronounce Latin well. Propitiatio. There you go. Propitiatio. My daughter took the Latin, not me, so.
Yeah, I'm pronouncing it in church Latin, not in classical Latin.
Okay, that's fine, because that's the church Latin use. All right, we'll not spend too much time on this kind of etymology stuff, but we will a little bit tonight just so that you get used to it. More importantly, my thing is on, right? Yeah, of course it is. All right. What is the Hebrew root word here for atonement? It's sometimes translated as kafar, or it's KPR. So like Yom Kippur, for example, is the same word, Kippur, kafar. It's again with Hebrew, it's kind of where you put the vowel notations to how do you pronounce it, and it gets wacky. And here you can see early, middle, and late in modern Hebrew and so forth like that. So I put it as kind of KPHR because sometimes you say KFR and sometimes you say KPR. So I fudged it tonight. All right. So the term kafar sometimes in its very earliest and root meanings means something like to wipe or to smear or to cover over, as with pitch, for example. For example, the first use in the scriptures, or the earliest use in the in the outflow of the Bible, is in Genesis 6, when God commands Noah to make the ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it. So there's the verb form of that root, wekaparta, and saw inside and outside with bakoper. So the KPR root is in there as well, with pitch. So cover, smear, pitch. Now, why would you do that for a boat? Anybody go on a boat before? Keep it waterproof, right? So it doesn't leak. I think there's some value in just thinking about that for a minute, because why are all these things in the Bible getting covered over and sealed with things? Maybe so they don't leak. What are they leaking? Well, we'll try to figure that out, I guess. So overall, the term, the concept has this meaning of to hide, to protect, to cover over. For example, when we get to the Ark of the Covenant, God commands that he make a cover for the Ark of the Covenant. That's this word as well. And of course, it's translated as mercy seat, lid, and in some translations, atonement lid, which is funny because there's no word lid there. It's just the word atonement. Make an atonement for the Ark of the Covenant. Make a covering for the Ark of the Covenant. So it's kind of a neat word in that respect. So we're going to think about this tonight. Atonement. We're not going to be looking at it so much in terms of like late medieval theology or Reformation theology. We'll touch on it briefly, but really it's the action of atonement that was being commanded by God, the liturgical action of atonement. I'm a priest, I study liturgy, I practice liturgy, I'm a liturgist, so my interest, of course, is what is the connection to this term with the liturgy? But not just out of curiosity, but because the main use of the word in Hebrew is, and the priest shall make atonement. It's something that the priest does over and over again. And we're going to look at how atonement is made, or how atonement is offered, or however you want to put it. But it is definitely an action, and the action involves these elements. In some way, a covering or a hiding or a sealing, a protecting, an enclosing, whatever you want to call it. And of course, as I mentioned, Yom Kippur is translated as Day of Atonement, of course, nowadays, because that's what it had to do with. Now, we're going to look at some of the other uses of atonement before we get to like Leviticus and the liturgical uses, so you can also see some of the other nuances of it. For example, in the story of Esau and Jacob is our next kind of early use of this root Hebrew word. Jacob commands his servants to go tell Esau that he's coming, and he wants to give him a gift because he knows that, he stole Esau's birthright, and he's expecting Esau to want to kill him, right? He's very scared. So he comes up with a kind of a plan to offer him a gift to appease him and so forth. But the interesting term here is that this verb for appease is a kepara, literally that I might cover his face or cover his eyes from my sin, right? The appeasing act is one of turning away the wrath, turning away the angry face of Esau from him. That's what's implied in this use. And so therefore it says, I will cover his face with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I shall see his face. Note that seeing of the face is part of this process. It's only after he has kind of covered the wrath or sealed it or smoothed it over, whatever you want to call it, that he feels safe enough to face him in person. Yeah. He's a character, isn't he? Yep. Yep.
It's like he sends the ones that the women and children that he's least affectionate for. I mean, doesn't he save like Rachel for last?
Well, yeah. I mean, he's Jacob is that character, right? He's always kind of playing and hedging the bets and all that. Just he's a great figure for a conflicted kind of hero, right? In many respects. Women and children first, right? So what happens in the next chapter? Esau is pleased by the gift, apparently, and he says, I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. I don't even need it, but I appreciate the gesture, right? Jacob said, no, please, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand, for I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Now, that's a wonderful compliment, or is it? What if you remember our earlier classes, what happens when you see the face of God? You die. Seeing the face of God is dangerous because God is holy, right? So he's kind of saying, I've seen your face. It's like this seeing the face of God. It's not just like a compliment, like, oh, you look really great. It's like I was terrified to see your face. For me to come before you was to face death itself. And I'm relieved that you have accepted me. So it's a beautiful image. This is a really valuable little kind of anecdotal story from the patriarchs so that we can understand what's happening later in atonement. If we're going to come face to face with God, one of the major things that's happening in the priestly acts of atonement is that a person is being able to approach the holiness of God. They're being made covered, so to speak, so that they can come close to God, and whatever was leaky or imperfect or out of tune or out of whack, whatever it was, primarily through sin, but not just through sin, as we'll see, that gets kind of smoothed over, covered over, sealed with the pitch of the sacrifice, if you will, and they can come face to face with God. So that's a really important concept. I would not want to be this guy for any money in the world.
Oh, no.
Another interesting use of the koper, the KPR root, is in the law later in Exodus 21. And this is a good example of the principles of justice in the law. We often hear, that God of the Old Testament is a vengeful God or all these things. But if you look closely and you read closely through the principles of law, especially in the book of Exodus, it's really quite fair and restorative, right? So, for an example, if there's an ox that gores somebody to death, you kill the ox, but the owner will not be held liable for it because it's an accident, right? It wasn't intentional, it wasn't no. But if the guy knew better, if there's a pattern of goring on the part of that ox and the man was warned about it, then it's what? Negligence. It's real negligence. And I mean, these principles are still with us today, I would say, in courts of law. You see how people are held liable for things. And, if there's a pattern of negligence, that obviously increases the liability on that person. But notice there, even so, if the man was negligent, basically guilty of negligent homicide, he could be stoned to death. Not only will the ox be put to death, but the owner might be put to death because he knew better. However, it gives the opportunity here, if a ransom is imposed on him. Now, this is sometimes translated with the lovely German term, Wehrgeld, right? Mangold, which is a term for ransom, but it was like in the medieval kind of German world, like if you killed somebody, you had to pay a Wehrgeld, you had to pay a certain kind of recompense to his tribe or family or whatever to make up for that. So it allows for this kind of arrangement. The term is translated ransom, but it's actually the word atonement as well, koper. So, and I talked a couple weeks ago in my sermon about the atonement money, the half shekel that you would give at a time of a census. But this is another example. So atonement might not just be a blood sacrifice; it might also be a gesture of restitution through money as well. But the main use of this verb and so forth is in the liturgical sense, as I said. And we're going to look at some of the main ones, and then we're going to work our way up to the big daddy of them all, right? Which is Yom Kippur itself, the rite of the Day of Atonement. Yeah.
You keep referring to the liturgy, the rituals, the priests. Is it possible for just normal individuals to atone for things? Is it possible for nations to atone?
Yeah, we're going to look at some of those examples. Yeah, but you're guessing where I'm going to go with this, because normally when we say make atonement, it's something that I do because I made a mistake, and I do it to somebody that I wronged, right? That's the kind of the modern everyday use of it. But actually the main use of it is almost always somebody makes atonement for you on your behalf. So it's an interesting difference of kind of approach that we see in the law of the Torah. So in Exodus 29, this is a weird use of the verb, right? 7 days you shall make atonement for the altar and sanctify it. Now again, if we're used to thinking about atonement is something I do when I did something wrong, right? It's me making up for something. It's me making an amends for something I did, or me turning around and repenting, or whatever, paying a price for my mistake. What the heck did the altar do? Why does the altar need atonement made for it, right? It's because that's not the original understanding. The original understanding is this deeper kind of covering and protecting and sealing so that it can come to be in the presence of God. That's what's going on here. So to make atonement for the altar is to sanctify it, to make it holy. And the altar shall be most holy. Whatever touches the altar must be holy. So the holiness of the altar is contagious holiness. So it has to be sanctified. And so you make it very holy. And it's re-sanctified once a year. And of course, this is not the Yom Kippur necessarily. This might be the altar of offering outside of the Holy of Holies. So with the blood of the sin offering of atonement, you make atonement for once a year throughout your generations. So atonement, regular consecration, reconsecration of the altar. Somebody once asked me about home blessings. So why do you got to do it every year? Isn't once good enough? I'm like, I don't know. In the Holy Temple, they had to consecrate the altar once a year. So how much how much more should maybe our homes be blessed, right? It's a regular part of this understanding of you're coming close to God. You need to renew that. You need to be constantly protecting and sealing and so forth. You go to the dentist at least once a year, right, so that you can keep the cavities away. Here's that example of the atonement money, and here's actually an example of a very ancient half shekel. There's been modern half shekel denominations minted that mimic this, which is pretty cool. But there are ancient ones that are looking like this. So when you take a census of the people of Israel, then each shall give a ransom, an atonement, a koper, for his life to the Lord when you number them, that there be no plague among them when you number them. I talked a little bit about this on the Sunday before last, where I talked about why would you have to be protected during a census? And I have theories, but that's all they are. It's definitely, there seems to be a sense that there is danger in holding a census, and people still feel kind of threatened when the government comes around and wants to pry, right? Wants to know about who lives in your house and all that. Maybe there's something like that in the ancient world, but maybe it's also the understanding that this kind of information can be used against the people of God by tyrants, like kings, like people want to round you up, that kind of thing. And that's what happens when King David later tries to have a census. It says that, and we saw this months and months ago, that the Lord rose up an adversary against David, basically a Satan, and an angel of death swept over the people, and people started to die because of the census, the illicit census that he was doing. It was not an appropriate thing. And so finally he repented, and it went away. But nonetheless, it's translated here as atonement money. Again, not what we normally think of with atonement. We usually think of atonement means some kind of sacrifice, a blood sacrifice. A half shekel doesn't sound like much. It's probably about $70 in today's labor value, maybe $5 in terms of the silver. So it doesn't seem like much, but nonetheless, it was understood as an act of atonement. Yeah.
To this day, religious Jews, because they're commanded not to count Jews, they have to count Jews
Right.
to, if they have a minion for prayer, a minion is at 4 out of 10 minutes, they for prayer.
Yep.
So when someone stands up to count how many men are there, he says not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6. That's how they get around that.
It's so brilliant. I love that kind of thing. Yeah, that's like the tithing of the cumin and the anise and leaving the weightier things, right? Finding the loopholes. Now here's another one. This is in 32. This is with the golden calf. The scene where Moses comes back down from the mountain, and is this interesting icon here, if you can see it, shows, it looks like a bunch of people dancing around a fire. I don't know. It's kind of a, yeah, the calf is right there. So I don't know, like, what are they? That's a pretty funny icon, honestly. But it came to pass that Moses said to the people, "You have committed a great sin. So now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." So they can't atone for their sin because they're defiled. Somebody has to do it in their place. So Moses offers to do it on their behalf. And how does he make atonement for their sin? He has to be willing to sacrifice himself. He's pretty distraught. This is a suicidal mission that he's taking upon himself. Then Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Oh, these people have committed a great sin and have made for themselves a god of gold. Yet now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, I pray, blot me out of your book which you have written." Right? If you're not going to forgive them, let me die. I can't live. Right? So this boldness, this faith of Moses is able to, assuage God for the moment. But God says, "I'm not going to blot you out, but some of them, are going to get blotted out." And bad things happen to those who committed the great sin, but not all of the people, thank God. So a holy remnant, again, the people were purified through plagues that came through and kind of took out the bad guys. Okay, other examples of atonement. This is one that we don't normally think of as an act of atonement, but it's right there in our church, in our yearly celebrations, and that's the Feast of the Presentation of the Lord. Why were they at the temple? To see Saint Simeon and Prophetess Anna? No, they were there. If you look real close, here's Joseph, and he's got something in his hands. 2 turtle doves. The partridge was outside in the pear tree. The 2 turtle doves were there as an act of atonement, to be an offering sacrifice. So there's many different offerings, and we'll just quickly go through them so you can see how it's actually outlined in the book of Leviticus fairly straightforwardly. So for example, Leviticus 1 just starts by explaining when you do a burnt offering, this is how you do it. And it says that it's offered as an atonement for someone, but it's not specified for what reason. There's no connection of it to sin. It's just simply a burnt offering. So when you make an offering through fire, that's a burnt offering. And it's a kind of a generic offering sacrifice. So it doesn't necessarily mean you did something wrong. It might mean you're coming up to give thanks to God and you want to give thanks to God. But to come close to his holy place and give thanks to God, you offer this atonement so that you can be there. Now, the next couple chapters down, you see the sin offering. But it's kind of an interesting name that we use. We call it the sin offering, but when you read the description of it, it's not what we would normally think maybe of as like sin. It's unintentional sins, or what we call in the church involuntary. Sometimes you'll see forgive their voluntary and involuntary sins. We're not talking about sins like, they were like suddenly, here, I have to do this thing. It means things they weren't intending. It wasn't from their will. It was something. So unintentional sins could be I overheard something that I shouldn't have heard, or I participated in something by accident, kind of. So there's a lot of things like that. Trespass offering then is where there's something that you actually did do, kind of involve yourself a little more intentionally or voluntarily. So those are trespass offerings, right? So that's a little bit different. So sin is a generic category, so to speak, of something that separates you from God's holiness. Trespass is where you've actually gone ahead and done something to break over that and to create that breach. And if you've taken my class on the sacraments, for example, in catechism, I talk about this. Confessing to the priest is part of that healing process. So whenever people say, where does it say in the Bible that you confess to a priest? Well, Leviticus 5 is a good example. People were healed of their sins through the confession of the priest, and that was understood to be an essential part of the ministry of the church in the Old Testament. Very naturally became part of the New Testament. Again, we already mentioned the purification of mothers. The 2 doves it's actually a double offering for the purification of mothers. That there's either a lamb and a dove, or 2 doves if you're not able to afford the lamb. One is a burnt offering, and one is for a sin offering. Again, it's not that the mother sinned, but the burnt offering is kind of the thanks sacrifice, right, for having given birth and gotten through that. The sin offering is because you became touched by blood and the bleeding of the pregnancy, the giving birth. So it's an uncleanness, not in a physical. It's going in kind of a physical way, but really it's that spiritual thing. When a person loses blood, it's part of their life has done what? Leaked. Thank you. See, call back. They've sprung a leak. And so there's whole things about bodily discharges as well, which is another category, lepers and so forth. So when there's a disturbance of the body, a loss of blood, a loss of fluids, things like that, that makes one unclean because life has left, and therefore kind of death has somehow gotten its kind of fingers into somebody a little bit. So that's the right understanding. It's not cleanness like, oh, that's like dirty. I don't think the right understanding of what cleanness is in this sense. It's about life and death. Lepers, for example, receive an atonement through the anointing of oil by priests. So this is a very similar kind of precedent to the sacrament of unction, for example, that we anoint for not just healing of soul and body, but also the forgiveness of sin, spiritual leprosy, if you will. So there's all kinds of different ways in which the priests are doing atonement or making atonement for the people of God. And only a few of them actually have to do with forgiving of direct intentional sins. A lot of it just has to do with this: we are bringing you close to God's holiness, and we are sealing you against the intrusion of death and restoring life. Because if you're going to come close to God, you need life. And why then is blood sacrifice a part of all of this? Is God bloodthirsty? No, because the blood that was lost, or the way in which life was dissipated because of the danger that was brought through whatever action, is restored then by the shedding of the blood of the animal. It's a reciprocation. Now, does that make sense to us today? We would probably not think of that, doing it that way, right? But that was the liturgical way that they did it. That was the symbolic way that they did it, because they were reflecting the understanding of life. And blood was the life, right? From the time of Noah. Don't eat the blood, or don't drink the blood of animals. That's their life. It's holy. It's not meant for you. You offer it back to God, because it's understood that it's not just red blood cells and plasma and white blood cells. It's the liquid that holds the energy of their soul. So when I say that's the blood is the life, they really meant that. If you don't have blood in you, what are you? You're a husk. You're dead. You're lifeless. So the pumping of your blood means your soul is there. So if you lose your blood, a little bit of your soul kind of is dissipated. So that's the real understanding there. Okay, so that leads us up to the big event of Yom Kippur, the atoning. And Yom Kippur has a number of stages of atonement, which are worth looking at. And it actually is very similar to how we approach things in the Orthodox Church, because I always like to say in my church services, classes on services, we always pray before we pray. We pray before we even get into the service. The priest has to pray to just vest for all of our services. The same was true of the Day of Atonement. The priest would have to make atonement for himself and for his whole house by offering a sacrifice. Just to approach the service of the Holy of Holies that day, he had to make an extra level of atonement, of preparation. And he shall take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, 2 handfuls of sweet incense beaten small, and he shall, God bless you, and he shall bring it in, a little bit of your soul, what, see? You need atonement now. And he shall bring it inside the veil. So when the priest first enters into the Holy of Holies, before he can even offer the sacrifice, the first thing he has to do is he has to offer incense. Now note what this does. He will put the incense on the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of the incense may cover, same verb there, covering, the mercy seat, the kapareth, the atonement lid or cover, that is over the testimony, so that he does not die. What? Why does he need to have a cloud of incense covering the mercy seat so that he won't die? Who sits on the mercy seat? That's where God would come to meet his people. That's where Moses would go in and speak face to face with God. And when he came out, his face was so shining, they had to put a veil on him because it was too much holiness. So the high priest goes, and he has to, before he can even approach the axe, he has to sense the space to kind of create a covering between himself and the extraordinary holiness of God. Studying this has just changed my entire way of understanding sensing in the church. When I go through the church and I'm sensing the altar, because I sense the altar multiple times during the Divine Liturgy, and it all actually makes sense this way. We sense it before the Divine Liturgy even starts, when we're finished with the Proscomedia. We sense it during certain services of the hours, but during the Divine Liturgy, we sense before 2 major things: before the reading of the Gospel and before the Great Entrance. Right? That's when you see the big sensing going on, because in those 2 moments, there is transfer of things to the altar that is going on. So the pattern is set here. in Leviticus. And he shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the mercy seat on the east side, and in the front of the mercy seat he shall sprinkle some of the blood with his finger 7 times. So then, after he has done that, he can begin the sprinkling of the blood as an offering of atonement. Now, then you get to the rite of atonement on behalf of the people. That was just the atonement before the atonement before the atonement, right? That was just the offering just to set things in motion and get things rolling. Because then the big thing is the goats. And I think we've talked about the goats before a little bit in this class, about how Christ is both the two goats. He's both the goat that is taken outside of the camp, but he's also the goat that's offered for the life of the people. So he shall kill the goat of the sin offering. There's two goats. One is establishes the goat for the Lord, for Yahweh, and the other one is the goat for who? Remember? You want to remember? For Azazel, yeah. Sometimes translated as scapegoat, but Azazel is essentially one of these, is the devil of the wilderness, right? Is the source of death, the personification of death and the devil that afflicts the people. So you take the goat of the sin offering that is for the people. That is holy because it is an offering to God. It's a burnt offering. It's a sin offering. You bring its blood inside the veil and you sprinkle it also in front of the altar, just as you did with the bull. So this is the next step over the mercy seat. That is on behalf of the people. And he shall make atonement for the holy place because of the uncleanness of the people of Israel and because of their transgressions. Interesting, it says atonement is for the holy place, not for the people. It's the atonement is being made, so the covering is being made over the holy place so that the sinfulness of the people will not pollute it, and so that they can approach the holy place. And in that sense, it's for their sake, right? And because of their transgressions and all their sins. So he shall do for the tent of the meeting, which dwells with them and in the midst of their uncleanness. So the tabernacle, the whole holy place becomes sanctified so that they can still approach God without fear. No one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement until he comes out and has made atonement for himself and for his house and for all the assembly of Israel. So people say, why do you have a screen up on that altar, and why can't people just go in whenever they want and things like that? Because the pattern is still based. Remember, this pattern is based on what Moses was shown of heaven. This is not something that was just meant to be meaninglessly temporary until Christ came, and then it was just outdated and irrelevant. It's the pattern underneath, the symbolic pattern of coming closer and closer to heaven. Therefore, we still have these kind of segregations, in the best sense of the term, of the holy places in the church. There is the Holy of Holies, which is the altar. There is the sanctuary, which is like the tent of meeting. And then there's the outer vestibule, the exonarthex, which is in the ancient days where people who could not take communion, for example, should have and would have stayed because they wouldn't have been in the sanctuary. Okay. Now, after that sanctifies the holy place, but you still have the problem of the people's, sin to deal with. So that's where the second goat comes in. And when he has made an end of atoning for the holy place and the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat, the other goat that's still alive. And Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions and all their sins. And he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who is in readiness. That poor guy had to go through a whole bunch of things too, just to be involved with that. And the goat shall bear all of their iniquities on itself to a remote area, and he shall let the goat go free in the wilderness. And just to make sure that the goat didn't wander back into camp, bringing all that sin with it, the guy who had to take him out made sure that when he let him go in a really precarious place. And so it's like it's a not sacrifice, right? Because he's not actually sacrificing it, because the sacrifice is something to make something holy to God that you will eat. This is like the anti-sacrifice. This is throwing it over a cliff so that it will never be seen again. And there's all kinds of interesting stuff. And I talked about this previously in another class about, how the breaking of the bones and the falling apart of the goat as it fell down into the rocky crevices and cliffs was to parallel what you see in the first book of Enoch, of what the judgment that was thrown on Azazel and his minions, the demons. They were thrown under the earth and covered over with sharp rocks and buried, in the dark of Tartarus, basically, right, in the depths. So that's the symbolism that's playing out here as well.
Is it bad that I feel sorry for the goat?
Yeah, who wouldn't feel sorry for this poor goat, right?
It seems, there are all kinds of laws in the Old Testament that prevent cruelty to animals.
Well, the law doesn't specify you should do this. This was one of those things.
They just add it on.
Yes,
Sure.
exactly.
Yeah.
Wasn't the concern that the goat sometimes would wander back?
Yeah, that's why. So they made it so that they set it free and it could never come back. Like in a movie where I'm thinking of Baron Harkonnen. I set her free of her mortal coil. And shows that this person is dead that he killed, and they go, ah. So anyway, yeah. Set you free of your earthly burdens. Yeah, so it's very unfortunate. So the goat for Azazel gets to go straight to Azazel and not come back. But again, it's not written that way in the law, but that's how they played it up. That's how they made it work. But what's interesting is that not only is there, and notice, do you notice anything here? Is there any mention of atonement through the goat?
When he has made an end of atoning, that's
The other goat, the other goat is the goat of atonement, if you will. The goat of Azazel is not involved. So so this is really important, by the way, because if we look at the concept of atonement, and I'm thinking now about those who are interpreting it like thousands of years later, after the 1500s, and they're saying that Christ had to die, to take on these sins like this goat. Well, that goat wasn't sacrificed. That goat was set free, was pushed away, and it wasn't eaten. All of the atoning sacrifices could be eventually used to eat, with some exceptions, because they were too holy. Not because they were unclean, but because they were so holy, they were fully burned, right? But these acts of sacrifices were not meant just for, once you took the blood and did the thing, you took the rest of the animal and you used it. And you fed the Levites and the priests, and sometimes even the people, okay? So and in all of this, there's no sense that an animal that's being used for atonement is in any way suffering punishment in behalf of somebody else. There's no description of how they killed it, just that its blood was used and that then it was eaten. The only time you see an animal actually kind of taking on this situation, it's the one that's sent out into the wilderness and not used and not touched. And the guy who did this job actually had to go through a whole ritual of kind of being purified just from the fact that he was leading the goat with a string, with a rope. He had to go through a whole process to come back into the camp, lest he bring pollution back. So atoning sacrifices were not substitutionary punishments at all. They were life restoring sacrifices and sin cleansing sacrifices and people God reconciling sacrifices. But punishment is not really involved in any of that. And so, which we'll get to why that's significant in a little bit here. Okay.
Father,
Yeah.
Isn't Azazel also mentioned?
Yeah, I mentioned that. Yeah. And we have a whole class on that when we talked about the spiritual powers of evil, if anybody wants to go back and look at that one. where we talk about that. Now, another very interesting use of the term of atonement even is used where God himself is said to make atonement. Which again, if your idea is atonement only means you make up for a mistake you made or something like that, this kind of doesn't really make sense. In the Song of Moses, which is kind of the kind of musical climax of Deuteronomy, at the very end of the Song of Moses, you see this, "Cry out, O nations, with his people, for he will avenge his servant's blood. He will take vengeance against his enemies and make atonement for his land and people." God himself is the priestly sacrificer who's making atonement on behalf of his people in the grand scope of kind of how the battle of the nations takes place. And that gets into the whole fun gigantomachy and the fighting the Amalekites and all that type of stuff that we talked about in those previous classes. And in Deuteronomy 21, the prayer is said to God. Now it's here's one of those examples where you see it kind of translated in a way to kind of fudge it to make it work better for the theology of English speakers. So it would say, "Forgive or absolve, O Lord, your people Israel," or "Accept this atonement, O Lord, for your people." But that's not what it says in Hebrew. It literally says, "Atone or make atonement, O Lord, for your people Israel." Because it's God who's doing the atonement. It's not they're making atonement and offering it to God. They're asking God to be the priestly figure who makes the atonement on their behalf. "Whom you have redeemed, do not lay innocent blood to the charge of your people Israel, and atonement shall be provided on their behalf for the blood." So it's a prayer for forgiveness from God, because God himself will be the one to offer the atoning sacrifice. He will be the one who will make the rite of atonement on behalf of the people. And I think this is a beautiful foreshadowing of what Christ does on the cross for us. He is, as a priest on the cross, offering the atonement of himself.
What's the icon?
Oh, what's that icon? Is Moses. Yeah. So some images of Moses show him like older Moses, but a lot of the icons of Moses show him as a younger man with a skull cap. Yeah, it's he's holding a scroll. It is said that every male that openeth the womb is holy unto the Lord. Yeah. So I like to find different icons of the saints as we go through this. Okay, so just to kind of summarize where we are, looking just at the Torah, basically, we see that atonement covered a variety of relationships, but primarily the relationship between God and his people, but also between the people themselves. You could have a situation where you need to create some kind of restitution between two injured parties, and that was where you get things like make a ransom, the atonement money type of thing. So there's also that relationship being restored. Through making atonement, God provided a way, usually through his priests, but sometimes directly himself, as we saw, so that they could approach, so that his people could approach his absolute holiness, for him to come and dwell with them. So you might remember, going back to some of the previous classes where we looked in Exodus, where they first kind of have that experience, that they're able to come and sit on the mountain of God and sit before God and eat and drink before the Lord, and they were not endangered. That's incredible. They're having this theophanic vision of Christ enthroned, of God enthroned, Yahweh enthroned, and they're able to eat before him and sit before him, commune before him, essentially. This is made possible through these acts of atonement. So atonement was something done for you, not by you, in the law, which I think is an important distinction that we can make. Thus, atonement was purifying and protective as well as forgiving. So it forgave you of whatever you might have done wrong, either intentional or unintentional, but it also not only kind of cleaned that out of the way, but then it kind of bolstered you, right? So you go to the dentist, you get your teeth cleaned, but sometimes you also get that fluoride, and it like seals over your teeth and gives you, strengthens your enamel. So the atonement sacrifices would do that as well. They would clean away the offending debris of life, spiritual and otherwise, but also strengthen you and protect you, shield you. Atonement also invariably includes the ritual elements aimed at removing or covering the cause of estrangement. Sorry, there's a typo there. So atonement was consistently an intrinsically liturgical action or set of actions. Much like what we see throughout the Old Testament, there's almost nothing done in abstract. Even the idioms of the languages we'll see are not ever kind of abstract terms. They always seem to have like a metaphor of the body or something to give you a concrete understanding. When we look at the wrath of God, we'll look at the Hebrew word for wrath and how it connects to and patience as like being long of nose or being hot, burning of nose. Because it's like the reflection of what that. It's not an abstract idea. It's something you experience when you're talking to someone. Right? It's not just you're ashamed, but that you cover your face. These kind of ideas. It's a physical, concrete type of thing. Similarly, all these acts of prayer and everything, they're not just disembodied, they're always liturgically embodied. They're very physical. Now, that's stuff where we look at it in the Torah, but of course, the concept of atonement within Christianity has a very rich and complicated history, and continues to kind of make for complications, I would say, between different denominations, jurisdictions, competing theologies, and so forth. It's certainly one of these things that I, as a catechist of the Orthodox Church, am often kind of running into willingly and unwillingly, because so many people have been shaped by a very late understanding of atonement, which comes out of the 16th, 17th century and so forth. So, but this history goes a long way back. This is from Father Stephen. We could probably draw back even earlier if we really wanted to. But he says that by the 7th and 8th century, Western theology, which is becoming less in touch with the Greek Church of the East, and is being kind of more isolated into a Latin language, maybe more heavily influenced by Augustine and so forth, it began to shift away from describing what Christ accomplished on the cross towards explaining the mechanisms of the how and the why that he accomplished it. Yeah.
That actually seems to be a very Latin thing, explaining the details, the mechanisms, and everything. Like, for example, a question came up in our little hipster group a week ago about
Your hipster?
Orthodox hipsters.
Orthodox hipsters, I love it.
A question came up about what happens in the Eucharist, right?
Right.
And one guy said, I don't get why people have a problem with transubstantiation. And I responded and I said, we don't have a problem with, bread and wine becoming the body and blood of Christ. What we have an issue with is trying to explain all the mechanisms and limit God.
Yeah.
It's a mystery. We don't know the mechanisms of how it happens, and that's what the Catholics are trying to do with labeling it transubstantiation and discussing how it does this and this and this and this and this.
Yeah.
We just leave it a mystery.
Yeah.
And so I think that's very, very, very common in Western thought, of trying to dig in and get very granular and very explainy about the details of how God does things.
Sure. Well, thank you. I don't like to beat up on Western theology because I've done it enough in my life, so I'm glad that you did
I
for me.
Really trying to beat up on it. It was just more like
no, but yeah, you're right. That's exactly it. It's and it has to do with kind of to a certain extent an approach towards theology, which becomes increasingly more philosophical versus mystical, which is a lousy term, frankly, because I don't think it means anything. But the maybe apophatic would be a little more technical in Greek theology.
In your sermon, you're talking about the bronze stick.
Yeah.
Didn't you say that Judaism spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly what that was all about and how?
I don't know if they spent a lot of time, but definitely like in the targums and the paraphrases and so forth and commentaries, they're trying to like, why would he make it? Why would they look at a snake and be healed?
Yeah, how does it work exactly?
Right, right. Yeah, and they're trying to explain like the deeper thing, yeah, to kind of ameliorate it a little, I guess, because it seems, because they're iconoclastic kind of at that point, maybe. They actually weren't, because you see that the Jewish synagogues had plenty of iconography in them. So, okay, but the kind of a turning point in Western theology, for example, is with Saint Anselm of Canterbury. He gets a lot of grief from certain quarters about this, but he is the most example in his work, Cur Deus Homo, Why the God Man. He introduced really this notion of satisfaction, that Christ's death satisfied the demands of God's justice, which had somehow been offended, right? And what he was doing was essentially he was using the metaphor of feudalism that existed in that day, because in the feudal world, it wasn't equal laws for people. If you committed a crime, if you were a peasant and you committed a crime against a peasant, there was one penalty. If you committed against your lord or the manor, of the manor, it was a worse penalty because it was considered to be more offensive. And if you, God forbid, committed a crime against the king, then you were really in trouble, right? Because it was a matter of who you injured, right? And so they took this logic, which was part of their social political system and legal system, and they applied it then, well, if the king is the worst, then how about the King of Kings, right? And therefore the logic is, well, there's no way you could ever pay that because it's just beyond anybody. So it needs, that offense is so grievous that it needs satisfaction. The only one who can satisfy it is the Son of God himself, because he's only equivalent enough essentially to make that work. So this becomes the logic for satisfaction atonement, or satisfactionary substitutionary atonement in a sense. And that kind of sets a certain standard going forward in the West, that much of that carries on into the Protestant Reformation, and it's not really questioned. But it's really a late development in terms of the understanding of what's happening there. Yeah.
With Anselm, is it still in an early stage? I mean, does it develop into this more extreme version that we see with Calvinists?
Yeah, so Calvin, for example, is a great example of that. You hear me say bad things about Calvin. I don't want to do that tonight. I just want to point out, Calvin was trained as a criminal attorney, right? A criminal lawyer. And so it was natural for him, in his context and day and age, to focus on the legal system and say, well, there's punishments for crimes and so forth. So the development, and maybe there's some of this in some of the Roman Catholic theology leading up to it, but it really kind of takes on the forms that we see it today in certain forms of Protestantism, not all forms, but it becomes the dominant model or paradigm or metaphor, whatever you want to call it, for how they explain atonement, is penal substitutionary atonement. That is, every person sinned, sin needs to be punished. No one can really pay that penalty and live, and so God has to send his son to die and suffer that penalty. Now, I'm actually going to show you that that's a perfectly kind of orthodox idea. But it all depends on what you understand is going on there. Because for Calvin viewed it as the penalty was eternal damnation. And so it wasn't enough that Christ should die on the cross. He also had to suffer the wrath of God of eternal damnation, which he does when he descends into hell. So his understanding of Christ's descent into the tomb and his descent into hell is not a harrowing of Hades, a triumphal breaking down of the bars and releasing the prisoners, though it might get to that point, but it is primarily the Son of God suffering the wrath of God in our stead, suffering the pangs of damnation for us. And of course, after Calvin, you have the later Calvinists like the Puritans, who were infamous, and most of us, if we grew up in this country, at some point probably had to read what's his name? Jonathan Edwards, right? Sinners in the hands of an angry God, right? So like, and God bless him. He was trying to say, isn't God merciful? Because like if you were holding a spider, you'd want to throw it. My girls always want me to kill spiders when they're in the house. I'm like, I don't want to kill the spiders. Like they eat the bugs and things I don't want in the house. They're like, but they're scary. Like it's okay. Edwards was trying to make a good point about God, but this idea that like, it's like a terrifying image of God. Like he's got this power to throw you into the fires of hell. Like it's kind of an abusive quality to that. I mean, I'm sorry, right?
Can I speak to that for a second? Because he is actually saying literally that God hates me.
You're so vile in his sight. You're like a spider.
Which is what I associate with Calvinism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because every time I ever wound up in a Calvinist church, the preacher told me what a worm I was and how unlovable I was. It's like, that's true. If I was unlovable, you wouldn't have died for me. It just makes no sense.
Yeah, it really. What was the? Trying to think, and I don't want to belabor the point, but you all know what it is.
You want me to read that paragraph?
No.
In the sermon where he calls everybody to Christ, just like John Chrysostom does.
Well, I know that's what I'm saying. He gets to a beautiful place, right? But the problem is that there's this intervening.
It's a great sermon. It's a super fire and brimstone sermon.
Fire and brimstone, yeah, right. I get it. But
it's a 19th century work. That's what it is. Like that's how.
Stop. 17th.
So the criticisms are there. Some are more valid than others, or some are more extreme. Let's suffice it to say, though, that just like most people, it's not Augustine so much, but the people who followed Augustine who got it wrong. Maybe it's not Edwards, but maybe it's the people that followed, because, I mean, harsh, strict, austere.
He's actually a late Puritan.
Yeah.
He's in the what was it? There was a renaissance of Puritanism in the early 18th century. Yeah. So.
Father, I just have one comment on the Calvinist reform substitution. I think it followed from Calvin abandoning the idea of the Aaron days and reinterpreting the phrase Christ descended to hell.
Yeah.
It's called Apostles' Creed.
Yeah.
To mean that Christ experienced
Gehenna.
The torment of Gehenna.
Yeah.
And then the story of the devil sort of no longer had a major part in that story.
Right.
And so it ends up becoming a story of God being angry at sinners.
God is the problem that you need to solve in that system.
Right.
God's wrath, God's anger, God's got a problem with you, and it needed to be solved. And so, for some reason, God figured out a way to make himself feel better. The whole thing kind of falls apart under, some scrutiny. So, in fact, that's what Father Stephen says. He says it collapses under scrutiny, mostly because to think about these things requires us to kind of project onto God kind of an anthropomorphism of God has to subject himself to these categories of being angry or being offended, or his justice needs to be satisfied, and God becomes trapped by his own righteousness or something like that. It has to paint, he painted himself in a corner, and this is how he gets out of it. So
God is so limited in that perspective.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes people confuse Anselm with Calvin, but Anselm argued, as I understand it, that Christ offered something good to the Father in lieu of us being punished, that God could accept us as an alternative to punishment.
Yeah.
Whereas Calvin argued God was obligated to punish sin.
Yeah.
And punish Christ so that we would not punish.
So now I'm going to show you in our last few minutes where they can actually exist in the Church Fathers. But then I'm going to try to pull it back so you can see the difference, because there is a difference. And that's difficult because some people will go and look into the Church Fathers and say, this sounds like my theology, so therefore they must have been teaching it too, which is really problematic because they weren't. They had a whole different cosmology, a whole different understanding of how liturgy works, atonement works, all these things that we've been talking about. So, they do utilize the language of substitution. That's really important to recognize, to be honest about that. But in the patristic view, Jesus accepts death, which is the wages of sin, in order to free us from the clutches of death, right? From the power of death. It's death that he accepts, not Gehenna, not eternal damnation. Because death is actually the penalty of sin, right? If you sin, you will die. The wrath of God remains on who? Those who refuse to accept what he has done. Those who have refused to love their neighbor, to love their Lord. Those who have blasphemed the gift of the Holy Spirit that came through Christ. The cross actually even forgives them of their death. Because guess what? They're going to rise from the dead too. But some will rise to the resurrection of life, and some will rise to the resurrection of judgment. They will be free from death to suffer what they chose, okay? So it's not that Christ substitutes himself so that we be free from damnation. It's actually his substitution sets the stage for people to be eternally damned, believe it or not. Because now they have to make a choice. Now there's no more, well, I can plead ignorance, right? Now I know. And if you look, we've looked in the cosmology parts of this class earlier, it's very clear within the Jewish idea that not everybody who died, for Calvinism to make sense, essentially, every single person who was ever born was being sentenced to hell. That's the only way that system makes any sense. But it's very clear within the Old Testament, within the Jewish concepts, that wasn't the case. You had Abraham's bosom. Abraham wasn't in torment. Lazarus went into his bosom, wasn't in torment. The Holy Fathers, the righteous, were understood to be dead, awaiting the resurrection, but they certainly weren't under the same penalty of eternal damnation. You could say, well, it's because they had the faith kind of preemptively, so they had a kind of a, whatever, they get into the whole, prevenient grace or whatever. But they were never in that situation. They were never in that boat of people that were like the rich man. Okay, so with that in mind, we can read the Holy Fathers and see that they also understood substitution, but they were understanding it in this Paschal sense of defeating death. So Athanasius, now as to the season spoken of, he will find for certain that, whereas the Lord always is, at length in fullness of the ages, he became man. And whereas he is the Son of God, he became Son of Man also. So this is about the incarnation. And to the object he will understand that wishing to annul our death, he took on himself a body from the Virgin Mary, that by offering this unto the Father as a sacrifice for all, he might deliver us all, who by the fear of death were all our life by fear of death were all our life subject to bondage. So death is being annulled. That's what is happening here. And it starts in the incarnation. The incarnation is the first step of that action, right? And only perfected or completed on the cross. Another point, Athanasius talks about settling accounts. This is often used, right? I had a debt, had to be paid, this kind of idea. But beyond all this, there was a debt owing which must needs be paid. For as I said before, all men were due to die. But that's different than all men were due to go to hell and suffer eternal torment. That's very, very, very different. Here, then, is the second reason why the Word dwelt among us, namely that having proved his Godhead by his works, he might offer the sacrifice on behalf of all, surrendering his own temple to death in place of all, to settle man's account with death and free him from the primal transgression. This is the ransom atonement theology, okay? This is the understanding that death had its claim on us. And when he fills death with himself, he destroys that claim completely because he has all the life, right? Infinite life. In the same act also he showed himself mightier than death, displaying his own body incorruptible as the first fruits of the resurrection. So his, it's like this is where you get into the dominant metaphor for atonement in the church fathers, which is this idea of ransoming us from death. The Leviathan fish monster of death swallows us like Jonah, but when Christ gets in there, he's causes the beast to spit us back out completely, and everybody else for that matter with him.
This makes me think of one of the hymns during Pascha where Hal says, "Oh no,
Yeah.
I made a mistake with this one."
Yeah, 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 and this is this is the theology behind C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? The same atonement, kind of like he frees all those who are frozen and turned to stone or whatever by suffering the death on the cross, the broken stone in the shape of a cross, right? St. Cyril of Jerusalem, the great catechist, he says two things happened. We were enemies of God by means of sin, and God ordained that the sinner should die. Of two things, then, one must needs have happened. So two things had to happen to fix this situation. Either that God should adhere to his word and destroy all men, or that by giving scope to his benignity, his benevolence, he should annul his sentence. But see the wisdom of God. He secured at once reality for his sentence and active operation for his benignity, for his benevolence. Because Christ took on himself our sins in his body on the tree, that we, being dead to sins through his death, should live unto righteousness. So there is a satisfaction taking place. That's correct. God's justice is being fulfilled. And I mentioned this on my sermon on Sunday. Note in Numbers 21 with this brazen serpent. They pray that God will free them from the snakes. He doesn't free them from the snakes, but he gives them a cure from the snake bites. God still allows the sentence to play out. We all die. But now there is a cure. Now there is a healing. Now there is a way for his benignity, his benevolence to show. He that died for our sakes was of no small account. He was not a literal sheep. He was not a mere man. He was not simply an angel, but he was God incarnate. The iniquity of the sinners was not so great as was the righteousness of him that died for them. Our sins did not equal the amount of his righteousness, who laid down his life for us, who laid it down when he pleased, and when he pleased, resumed it. He had the life to give, and he was
Father, this is
Yeah.
Elaine.
Hi, Elaine.
I have a question. When God expels Adam and Eve from the garden because he doesn't want them, because he loves them so much, he doesn't want them to eat of the tree of life and remain in that fallen state.
Right.
So he says you can't have access to this tree of life. So in some respect, is death not a sort of a benefit?
Yes. Yeah. Because
Rather than
only
just
through
being a punishment?
Yeah, no, actually it's only it's a penalty in the short term, right? Because our life comes to an end and it's sad and it's painful. But in the end, it will be revealed to be a profound blessing, because only through death does sin come to an end, right? When a man dies, he puts an end to sin. So death was originally our prison, was originally our trap, was originally a source of despair and hopelessness. Now for Christians, we prepare for death joyfully. We know that we will put aside the sins that afflict us when we die, and the next part will be glorious, will be wonderful, will be resurrection to life. So we should be preparing for death with joy and not fear. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
So God giving us death by expelling us from the garden and not letting us have the tree of life. If we had stayed in the garden, we would have had life eternal.
Yeah, and it wouldn't have been great. I like to liken it to vampires, right? Vampires get eternal life, but at what cost? You know, they're perpetually cut off from real life. And so if you live eternally in a state of fallenness, that's like the demons. It's a horrific situation. And so we see that in the baptismal prayers in particular. God could not stand to see us oppressed by the devil, therefore he came and saved us. He rescued us from that.
Thank
So
you.
if you enjoyed tonight's class, please consider supporting the parish at our website or our giving page, or you can also text. Right? Also subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'll be taking off the video, the live feed, and then anybody else who would like to ask questions can stay after class. May God bless you. Oh, I want to close with one thing. This was from last night. This is from the Vespers of the Holy Cross. Not only do we look at the writings of the church fathers, but we also always look at what we actually pray in church for our theology. If the prayers of the church don't say it, then it's not something the church believes, and vice versa, right? So this is what's called the doxasticon, which is it's the hymn that comes after the glory now and ever, for the Stichera of the Lord I have called. So it's the kind of the culmination of the hymnography for the day. And this is for the Feast of the Cross. Come all you nations, let us fall down and worship before the blessed tree by which eternal justice has come to pass. For he who deceived Adam by a tree is caught by the lure of the cross, and he who held under his tyranny the creature endowed by God with royal dignity is brought down in a headlong fall. The serpent's venom is washed away by the blood of God, and the curse of just condemnation is undone, when the just one is condemned by an unjust judgment. For it was fitting that the tree should be healed by a tree, and that by the passion of the passionless God, what was wrought on the tree should destroy the passions of man, who was condemned. But glory to your dread dispensation for our sakes, O Christ the King, through which you have now saved us all, since you are good and the lover of mankind. Amen. Christ is among us.